Hi, we're here on the second Friday of these two-week negotiations, which should be the final day at COP15. And of course, at this point, with heads of state and government flooded into the Bella Center, we are at the very final tense period. We understand now that there are drafts of different kinds of documents that are floating around and under consideration by different groups of heads of state, sometimes bilaterally, sometimes in larger groups. And at this point in the negotiations, there's always a lot of rumor floating around as to what's really happening. The kinds of experts and even ministers with whom we often have contact are sometimes outside the door as the Obamas and the Wens and the Whos and so forth actually sit together and talk about the final deal. We have seen some signs earlier today of movement and some encouraging statements after 2 weeks of rather discouraging talks, and so we are hopeful that we might yet see improvement to the kinds of drafts that were floating around earlier today. Coming from the European Union office, the European Policy Office of WWF, I would like to give a bit more of the European perspective on these talks. Europe passed a large package of legislation at the end of 2008, which covered all kinds of measures related to climate change and energy. And at that time, they really set the tone for international climate policy. And so Europe has always regarded itself as the leader internationally and largely came to these talks expecting other parties to move. And it had one big card that it could play here at COP15, which is that it had conditional language around how it would improve its own emissions reduction target by 2020. That is, that it already has a unilateral target of 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. But it guaranteed that if there were an acceptable deal here among other parties, it would improve its offer to 30%. And so a lot of the process here has been trying to define what the conditions are that would help Europe move to 30% and whether or not Europe has actually managed to find agreement within its own leaders as to what those conditions are and the trigger it would do. So as we understand it, they have been meeting in various formations behind the scenes and trying to argue amongst themselves how it is that they are going to determine whether or not they do go to 30%. The problem, as we see it, is that all along we've seen plenty of evidence that Europe's 20% target is far too weak. And in fact, it could move to 30%, even giving an economic gain to Europe. A lot has happened since it created this formulation of 20 or 30% in 2007 originally. We've seen a big change in the economy. We've seen large reductions in Europe already, so that it could probably rather easily meet its 20% target. And I think people around the world know that's the case. And so the 30% has represented perhaps less leverage than it thought it would. But this week, we see them trying to play that card and trying to find the way that they can put it on a table that still retains some leverage over other economies. In particular, they've wanted to see the United States improve their offer for emissions reductions that they had announced a couple of weeks ago. They've also wanted to see China do more effort, whether that's in terms of emissions reductions or in other aspects of the negotiations. Has not been entirely clear. But it is quite clear that the EU hopes that they will be able to get something out of these two powers in order to trigger that move to 30%, but are not entirely in agreement internally as to what that might mean. We're concerned that what this may result in is Europe actually losing its chance both to put a mark on the talks, to improve conditions within Europe, and actually drive the process forward. There was some agreement emerging around a financing package for developing countries, with Hillary Clinton echoing language from some European and African leaders for long-term financing on the order of $100 billion. This relates to a similar figure from the European Union. So with that announcement yesterday, we feel that now is the opportune time for the EU to come back with its target offer, put that on the table, and keep the momentum moving forward so that we will actually see a successful result to the talks at the end of the day today. That's the kind of bold step that's really necessary because as things stand at the moment, there's no great clarity that we are going to emerge from this with a deal that not only is done, as President Obama seemed to indicate earlier, but is done well. And it's going to require the input of many different parties to ensure that those conditions to have an adequate deal that actually keeps us below 2-degree warming is on the table, and Europe can play a really big part in that. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again later.